They called it the wickedest city on earth, a place where pirates ruled the streets, where gold flowed like rum, and where every vice imaginable thrived openly under the Caribbean sun. Port Royal, Jamaica, was the richest and most notorious city in the New World, a den of thieves where fortunes were made and lost in a single night, where legendary pirates like Henry Morgan walked as kings. Then, in just 2 minutes on a sunny June morning in 1692, the entire city vanished beneath the waves. Buildings, treasure, people, all swallowed by the sea in one of history's most catastrophic disasters. What remained was a perfectly preserved snapshot of pirate life, frozen underwater at the moment of destruction. This is the story of Port Royal, the city that's been built and the sea destroyed. To understand Port Royal's rise, you need to understand the geopolitics of the 17th century Caribbean. Spain had claimed most of the New World, extracting enormous wealth from its colonies in gold, silver, and other resources. Spanish treasure fleets carried these riches back to Europe, making Spain the dominant power of the age. But other European nations wanted their share of this wealth, and they found a convenient solution. Pirates, the English in particular, embraced what they called privateering. These were essentially legalized pirates, given official letters of marque that authorized them to attack Spanish ships and settlements. The arrangement was simple. Pirates kept most of what they plundered, and the English crown took a percentage while gaining a powerful weapon against Spain. It was piracy with government approval, and it made certain men incredibly wealthy. Port Royal became the headquarters of this pirate enterprise. Located on a narrow spit of land at the entrance to Kingston Harbor, the city occupied a strategic position. Any ship entering or leaving the harbor had to pass Port Royal's guns. The deep, protected harbor could accommodate hundreds of vessels, and the city's position at the crossroads of Caribbean shipping lanes made it the perfect base for pirates hunting Spanish treasure. The city grew explosively. In just a few decades, Port Royal transformed from a small settlement into one of the wealthiest cities in the New World. At its peak, the city's population reached nearly 10,000 people, crammed into a space barely larger than a few city blocks. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, an unusual height for the era, reflecting both the city's prosperity and its limited space. The wealth that flowed through Port Royal was staggering. Pirates would return from raids carrying chests of Spanish gold doubloons, silver pieces of 8, emeralds from Colombia, pearls from Venezuela. They spent their plunder as quickly as they acquired it, creating a booming economy of taverns, gambling houses, and brothels. Merchants grew rich supplying the pirates with everything from weapons and gunpowder to fine clothing and imported wine. One contemporary observer wrote that Port Royal had more gold and silver per capita than any city in the world. The streets were literally paved with wealth. Taverns supposedly never closed, with drinking and gambling continuing around the clock. Prostitutes outnumbered respectable women by wide margins. Violence was common, with duels and brawls a daily occurrence. Yet for all its lawlessness, Port Royal was also a functioning city with shops, churches, government buildings, and respectable merchants. The most famous resident of Port Royal was Henry Morgan, perhaps the most successful pirate in history. Morgan led devastating raids against Spanish settlements throughout the Caribbean and Central America. He sacked Panama City, capturing enormous quantities of treasure. He attacked Portobello, Maracaibo, and countless Spanish ships. The Spanish considered him a bloodthirsty criminal. The English made him a knight and appointed him lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Morgan lived in Port Royal like a king. He owned multiple properties in the city, including a large townhouse on High Street, the main commercial thoroughfare. He entertained lavishly, hosted grand dinners, and wielded enormous political influence. When he died in 1688, 4 years before the earthquake, he received a state funeral with full honors. His career embodied everything Port Royal represented: the thin line between crime and legitimacy, between piracy and politics. But Port Royal had a fatal flaw. The narrow sand spit on which it was built was inherently unstable. The land consisted largely of unconsolidated sand and gravel deposited by ocean currents. Heavy brick buildings on such loose foundation created enormous stress. The English had filled in parts of the harbor to create more land for building. further destabilizing the soil. Every structure added weight to ground that could barely support it. June 23, 1692, started as an ordinary day in Port Royal. The weather was fine, hot and clear as usual. Ships sat at anchor in the harbor. Merchants conducted business. Pirates spent their money in the taverns. The church bells were ringing for the noon service. Then, at approximately 11:43 in the morning, the ground began to shake. The earthquake struck with terrifying force. Contemporary accounts described 3 distinct shocks, each more violent than the last. The shaking was so intense that people couldn't stand. Buildings swayed like ships in a storm. Church bells rang wildly from the violent motion. People stumbled into the streets in terror, only to be struck by falling debris. Then something even more catastrophic occurred. The violent shaking caused liquefaction. The water-saturated sand beneath Port Royal literally turned to liquid. The ground simply opened up. Entire buildings, with their occupants still inside, sank straight down into the earth. Some structures tilted at crazy angles, half submerged. Others disappeared completely, swallowed whole. The northern section of the city, where the ground was weakest and the buildings heaviest, suffered the worst damage. A huge area, roughly 33 acres, encompassing the wealthiest commercial district, slid into the harbor. The slide created a massive tsunami that surged back over the remaining parts of the city, sweeping away people, buildings, and anything not firmly anchored. Eyewitness accounts paint a horrific picture. People were buried alive as buildings collapsed. Others were trapped in structures sinking into the liquefied soil. The tsunami drowned hundreds who had survived the initial quake. Ships in the harbor were tossed about like toys, some driven inland by the wave. Others capsized and sunk. The HMS Swan, a Royal Navy frigate anchored in the harbor, was picked up by the wave and deposited on top of submerged buildings, where it remained as a bizarre monument to the disaster. What do you think it must have been like to experience those 2 minutes? Imagine standing on High Street, Port Royal's main commercial avenue, conducting business or perhaps entering a tavern. The ground suddenly lurches beneath your feet. You stumble, trying to keep your balance as the violent shaking continues. Buildings around you are swaying, their brick walls cracking. People are screaming. Then you feel the ground giving way. The entire street is sinking. Water is rushing in. Buildings are toppling. The noise is deafening, a combination of crashing structures, screaming people, and the roar of rushing water. In just moments, everything you knew has disappeared beneath the waves. The death toll was enormous. Estimates vary, but most historians believe around 2,000 people died immediately in the earthquake and tsunami. That's about 20% of the city's population, killed in less than 2 minutes. In the following weeks, disease and injury claimed perhaps another 3,000 lives. By the end of summer, half of Port Royal's population was dead. The destruction was nearly total. 2/3 of the city had sunk beneath the harbor. Of the portion that remained above water, most buildings were severely damaged or completely destroyed. The commercial heart of the city, with its wealthy merchant houses, warehouses full of goods, and the taverns where pirates spent their plunder, all of it now lay underwater. The survivors were left in desperate circumstances. Food and fresh water were scarce. Shelter was nearly impossible to find. Looting was rampant as desperate people scavenged through the ruins. Disease spread quickly in the tropical heat among the crowded survivors. The stench of decomposing bodies, both human and animal, hung over what remained of the city. Some saw the disaster as divine judgment. Port Royal had been called the wickedest city on earth, after all. Preachers proclaimed that God had destroyed this modern Sodom for its sins. The earthquake occurred on a Wednesday, but some contemporary accounts mistakenly reported it as Sunday, perhaps to strengthen the moral narrative. The city where pirates ruled and vice flourished had been punished by divine wrath, or so the story went. But Port Royal's destruction was entirely natural, the result of building a heavy brick city on unstable, water-saturated sand in one of the most seismically active regions of the Caribbean. The same geological forces that created Jamaica's mountains and shaped the island continue to generate earthquakes. Port Royal simply had the misfortune to be built in the wrong place at the wrong time. The English attempted to rebuild Port Royal, but the city never regained its former prominence. Another earthquake in 1712 caused further damage. Hurricanes repeatedly battered the exposed sand spit. The center of power and commerce gradually shifted to Kingston, on the more stable mainland shore across the harbor. Port Royal slowly faded from a great city to a small fishing village. But beneath the harbor waters, the sunken portion of Port Royal remained, perfectly preserved. The same sudden submersion that killed so many people also created ideal conditions for preservation. Buildings that sank intact were quickly covered by silt and sand, protecting them from erosion and decay. Objects inside these buildings were sealed away from oxygen and light, preventing the usual deterioration. For nearly 3 centuries, sunken Port Royal lay forgotten beneath Kingston Harbor. Occasionally, local divers would recover artifacts, but no systematic exploration occurred. Then, in the 1960s, archaeologist Edwin Link began the first professional underwater excavation of the site. What he found astonished the archaeological world. Port Royal proved to be an underwater time capsule of 17th century life. Unlike most archaeological sites, which accumulate artifacts over long periods, Port Royal represented a single moment frozen in time. Everything dated to June 23, 1692, or earlier. There was no later contamination, no mixing of periods. It was as if someone had taken a photograph of an entire city and preserved it underwater. The artifacts recovered tell vivid stories of daily life in pirate Port Royal. Pewter plates and tankards from taverns, clay pipes that pirates smoked, bottles that once held rum or wine, Chinese porcelain, evidence of global trade connections, surgical instruments from the city's physicians, navigational equipment from ships, weapons, jewelry, coins, clothing fragments. Each object is a piece of the puzzle, helping archaeologists reconstruct how people actually lived in this notorious city. One of the most significant finds was an intact pocket watch, stopped at exactly 1143. The watch had belonged to a wealthy merchant or ship captain. When the earthquake struck and he was plunged into the water, his watch stopped at the precise moment of the disaster. That small mechanism, preserved in the anaerobic conditions underwater, gives us the exact time that Port Royal's world ended. Buildings, too, survived in remarkable condition. Archaeologists found entire structures largely intact, sunk into the harbor floor. A tavern with its bar and storage areas. Merchant shops with goods still on shelves. A cobbler's workshop with leather and tools. Private homes with their furnishings. The brick walls, though damaged, still stood. Doorways and windows were recognizable. Streets and alleys were still visible under the silt. One particularly poignant discovery was the skeleton of a young woman, still wearing her jewelry, trapped in the ruins of a building. She had been killed instantly when the structure collapsed during the earthquake. Her remains, along with those of others found at the site, provide direct physical evidence of the human cost of that terrible day. The excavations also reveal details about 17th century construction techniques, diet, trade patterns, and daily activities that would be impossible to learn from documents alone. Archaeological evidence often contradicts or complicates the written record. Port Royal shows us not just how people said they lived, but how they actually lived. For instance, the artifacts show that Port Royal was more diverse and complex than the simple pirate stereotype suggests. Yes, there's evidence of the wild lifestyle, the drinking and gambling and violence. But there's also evidence of ordinary family life, of craftsmen practicing their trades, of merchants conducting legitimate business, of a functioning civic society. Port Royal was simultaneously a pirate haven and a normal colonial town. The excavations have been challenging. Working underwater is always difficult, but Kingston Harbor presents particular problems. The water is murky with poor visibility. Strong currents complicate diving. Modern shipping and pollution threaten the site. The artifacts, once exposed, deteriorate rapidly if not properly conserved. Each season of excavation requires extensive planning, specialized equipment, and expert conservation to prevent the destruction of irreplaceable material. Despite these challenges, work continues. New technologies like multi-beam sonar, underwater robotics, and advanced photogrammetry are revealing details of the submerged city that earlier archaeologists couldn't access. Computer modeling helps researchers understand the earthquake and tsunami dynamics. DNA analysis of skeletal remains provides information about the population's health, diet, and origins. Recent surveys suggest that much more of Port Royal remains to be discovered. Large areas of the submerged city have never been properly excavated. Entire sections may still lie buried under harbor sediment, waiting for future archaeologists to uncover their secrets. Each new excavation season brings fresh discoveries that refine our understanding of this unique site. What makes Port Royal particularly valuable to historians is its documentary richness, combined with archaeological evidence. We have extensive written records about the city, maps showing its layout before the disaster, official documents, personal letters, court records, and numerous eyewitness accounts of the earthquake. These can be directly compared with the physical evidence recovered from underwater. This combination of documentary and archaeological sources is rare and enormously valuable. The written records, for example, tell us that Henry Morgan owned a house on High Street. Archaeological excavations have located the probable site of that house, along with artifacts consistent with the wealthy merchant's residence. Documents describe specific taverns and shops. Archaeologists have found structures that match those descriptions. This interplay between written and physical evidence brings history to life in unique ways. Port Royal also serves as a powerful reminder of the impermanence of human achievement. This was one of the wealthiest, most powerful cities in the Caribbean. It seemed invincible, protected by strong fortifications, wealthy beyond measure, home to men who had defeated Spanish armadas. Yet in 2 minutes, nature erased 2/3 of it from existence. No amount of wealth or power could save Port Royal from the earthquake. The parallels with modern coastal cities are sobering. We continue to build major urban centers in seismically active zones, often on unstable ground, in areas vulnerable to tsunamis. Port Royal's fate reminds us that nature doesn't care about human ambitions. The same forces that created the beautiful Caribbean islands can destroy what we build on them. But there's also something inspiring about Port Royal's story. The fact that this notorious city, destroyed and largely forgotten, has yielded such treasures of historical knowledge 3 centuries later speaks to the value of archaeological preservation. The artifacts recovered from Port Royal's ruins have immeasurably enriched our understanding of 17th century colonial life, maritime history, and the age of piracy. Every tavern mug, every clay pipe, every piece of 8 recovered from Port Royal's waters tells part of a larger story. The story of how ordinary people lived in an extraordinary place and time. The story of a city that, despite its reputation for vice and violence, was also a community where people worked, raised families, built homes, and tried to create futures for themselves. The pirates of Port Royal, the merchants who grew rich supplying them, the craftsmen who built their ships, the tavern keepers who served them, the sailors who crewed their vessels, all of these people are long gone. But their city remains, preserved beneath the waves, waiting to share its secrets with anyone patient enough to listen. Today, Port Royal above water is a quiet village, bearing little resemblance to its former glory. A few old buildings survive, including parts of Fort Charles, where Henry Morgan once commanded. A small museum displays artifacts recovered from the underwater excavations. Tourist boats offer views of the harbor where the great pirate city once stood. But the real Port Royal, the city of legend, lies beneath the surface. There, in the murky waters of Kingston Harbor, the wickedest city on earth sleeps its long sleep. Its streets are silent now, traveled only by fish and the occasional archaeologist. Its taverns serve no more drinks. Its shops have long since closed, but the stories embedded in its ruins continue to speak, telling us about a vanished world, about the golden age of piracy, about the precariousness of civilization, and about the power of the sea to both destroy and preserve. Port Royal reminds us that history isn't just found in books and documents. Sometimes the most vivid history lies underwater, waiting in the ruins of sunken cities, in the artifacts scattered across the seafloor, in the buildings that sank but did not die. Every dive into Port Royal's waters is a journey back in time, a chance to walk the streets where pirates walked, to touch the places they touched, to see their world as they saw it. The earthquake of 1692 destroyed Port Royal, but it also preserved it for us. creating one of the most important underwater archaeological sites in the world. From that disaster came an opportunity, centuries later, to understand our past in ways that would otherwise be impossible. The city that sin built, that God supposedly destroyed, has become a gift to future generations, a window into a fascinating, brutal, vibrant world that shaped the Caribbean and influenced the course of history.